I'm excited to get into this topic and content on the half-truth of generosity. Dr. McKenna is going to lead this content. He is our CEO and founder and creator of the WiLD Toolkit. And what I love about these topics every week, and part of the reason I love working with Rob, is that as one of the leading industrial and organizational psychologists across the country, he makes my brain hurt often by taking concepts that I might just say or look past often and get a little bit deeper, turn them around, and help me think a little bit more nuanced about them. So with that, Rob, could you lead us into the half-truth of generosity, which I know is going to spark a great conversation here in a few moments.
That's a horrible sell to be my friend. He makes your brain hurt, so hang out with him. That's great. I think I've come to accept that that's kind of what I do sometimes, and so I'm excited for this conversation. This has been an amazing series, and those of you that are new to this, the rest of you know this, that I'm figuring this out with you. My attempt is to bring some science to these topics and some deeper thinking, but it's not because I'm thinking. It's just because I get a chance as I prepare to just set the stage for a conversation, is to say, let's go a little bit deeper. Let's not skim over the surface of these things. And I would say that generosity, once again, has been challenging for me. So I'm going to give you my thoughts, and then we will crowdsource wisdom together. I think what's interesting is this is such a hopeful topic and also sobering. And so I hope that I leave you with a dose of hope, or at least launch conversations with hope, but it's also really sobering to me. And I'm kind of that person. I live between the hopefulness and my music genre is somewhere between, is actually hopeful melancholy. So it's not surprising that that's kind of who I am. But so when it comes to generosity, I'm going to skip past the surface, which I think is important. But is that so often we think of types of generosity, and I've heard this said before, that when it comes to giving, that so often the things that you could think about giving are time, treasure, and talent. And we could have a whole conversation around that, which I think is important to think about. What are the things that are challenging for you to give? And I think time, treasure, and talent are interesting ways to think about what it is we give. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Just know that that's where we start off a lot of times related to this topic. But one of the things I also thought about was, what does this topic have to do with generosity? I'm sorry, what does this topic of generosity have to do with leadership? And I think my brain went, as I got into thinking and getting to the research, it became really clear that the concept of giving has a lot to do with leadership, especially when you think of the kind of leaders that we're hoping to invest in as courageous and sacrificial leaders, people who are both have a sense of themselves, but also have a sense of what they may need to sacrifice to lead well. And so let's just jump in. So what is generosity? I always like to break these things down. Like, what are we actually talking about? So let's get to some definitions. Here's one: the spirit or action of kindly and freely giving to others. The spirit or action of kindly and freely giving to others. All right, that's one. Now, listen to this next definition that I think relates to the first. I don't think it's actually like two separate, you have definition A and B, and sometimes in the dictionary they're separate, they're different things. They're actually kind of related when we get further into this. The second one: freedom from meanness or smallness of mind or character. Whoa, that's the sobering part. Generosity being defined as freedom from meanness or smallness of mind of character. Fascinating. So that caused me, when I saw that, to look up I like to look at the opposites. What is this? What is generosity not? Here's some words: cheapness, closeness, meanness, parsimony, not what generosity tends to be, pinching, selfishness, stinginess, tightness. It's interesting. Like, are you seeing the way that generosity has some linkages to our character? I'm like, kind of interesting. It's like, what is this not? It's fascinating. So in other words, it's not cheap, closed, mean, oversimplified, pinch, selfish, stingy, or tight. Generosity is the opposite of those things. Here are my 3 points I want to make in these brief comments. Number one, and I'm gonna say my points, and then I'm gonna talk through some research, and then I'm gonna say my points again, and then we're gonna go talk about it. Here are my 3 points. Generosity is about our character. Point number 1, generosity is about our character. Point number 2, generosity is about us and about them. It's not just about them. Number 3, our generosity is related to our capacity to receive. Our generosity is related to our capacity to receive. So let's talk about this. So here's what's interesting. I did a little bit of research. I'm getting out there. I like to get into the science, even beyond my own field of industrial organizational psych, get into a little brain science, kind of fascinating. So there's been some research on what's called targeted and untargeted generosity or giving. Targeted or untargeted, being the difference being whether or not you are connected to or know the specific person or thing that you are being generous to, okay? Untargeted would be you're just giving without as much of a target, which is fascinating when you think about it related to goal setting and some of the importance of specificity. But anyway, which also probably has some related stuff, is me integrating too much. But anyway, targeted and untargeted giving. Listen to this. Untargeted giving and targeted giving are connected to the part of the brain known as the central or ventral striatum. Okay, let me tell you what that part of the, I know, tomorrow you're like, okay, here we go. Okay, which is the home in the brain of altruism. Okay, now this is what's even more interesting. You know what else that's the home of in the brain? Compulsion and addiction. Interesting. The same place in our brain that we process altruism gets lit up. So here's the thing. When we give, targeted or untargeted, it lights up the part of the brain that's also related to altruism and also related to compulsiveness and addiction. So it's interesting that maybe this concept of giving also triggers something in us that's related to other things going on physiologically for us, they're brain-wise, okay? But it's interesting that it lights up 2 parts of the brain. This is an interesting thing in terms of character because it lights up something that's important in terms of our capacity to sacrificially be in the world, but also our capacity to make it all about us at the level of addiction. Like, it's really interesting. And I would suggest that that's more human than just saying it's all about altruism. Because that's the real story. And we get into the real and wild story here is like, that's what this is about. Okay, here's the thing. But targeted giving does something different. Targeted giving, so if you're connected to it, it's a more specific target. It also lights up a different part of the brain, which is the amygdala. And the amygdala is where we process anxiety. So targeted giving also has the other benefit of decreasing anxiety. Interesting. I don't even know where to fully unpack that, but it's interesting. Now so in other words, targeted giving does both. It does both sides of that. Untargeted giving does not tend to have an anxiety reduction possibility. Now, here's what's interesting about what I just said. Also, at sort of a meta level, everything I just said is like, here's like if someone were to pitch this at some airport seminar, you should give because it'll reduce your anxiety, make you more altruistic. They probably wouldn't say, and you'll be more addicted to it. They probably wouldn't say that. But my point is this, is that there is one lens on it, is to say it actually does something for us. It does something to us. And that's really fascinating given the real conversations that we have about this. And so one of the things that I think of in this example is, so I've been on what are called short-term mission projects overseas with NGOs. And there's this argument that people say, if people have never gone overseas to work in like 2/3 world countries or to serve in those places, a lot of times when people go for the first time, what they want is they'll say like, I just want to feel like I did something. You know what I mean? I want to feel, but with the conversation we don't have is like, oh, so you want to feel, we blame them for that. You want to feel like you did something. Is that the reason to go? But I think the reality is that that's okay. That there's a part of us that wants, that has this necessity to fulfill something within us, but that ultimately it's also going to be about serving there. And I get bugged by people who've been involved overseas or in different parts of the world for longer terms who bash people who go for 2-week stints, because I think there is a benefit. And I think giving permission to the real conversation that people are having. I would tell you that my experience, and I don't know about yours, is that actually I get more than I ever give. And part of that's just the relationships that develop. So the point of that, even the brain science, is this both has to do with you and with them. Here's what's also kind of interesting. I had a conversation with a university president. A lot of university presidents, they're especially small private colleges, their biggest job is fundraising. And he said something to me that was fascinating. He said, when you're going out to raise funds for your institution, to do that well, you have to believe at your core that anything someone gives is a bigger benefit to them than it is to the institution. Really, it's really provoking. You know what I mean? Like, could you believe if you were raising funds for something that it actually would do more for the donor than it would for the organization? And I think he has something there. I think there's something very wise and controversial in that, that we could get into. Fascinating. It's interesting also, let me say something about the research before I finish and launch us out there, is that there have been some associations with giving and generosity in terms of the predictive thing within us, and it's a linkage to humility. So here's what's fascinating about this, and just one more thing to think about, is that if humility has a linkage to our generosity, and humility being a lowering of oneself or never seeing oneself higher than one is, actually, like, it's really defined. We talked about that a few weeks ago. If humility is connected to generosity, what's kind of fascinating is this question of how does generosity, our capacity to give, relate to our capacity to receive? Because what's interesting is that receiving is one of the most humbling things you could possibly do. It is so difficult to lower ourselves to say, I need you, or I need resourcing from you, or I need your help. And it's interesting because that's one of the linkages to humility. And so I started thinking about this cycle of humility leading to generosity, and generosity being built up by this, our capacity to receive, and then our capacity to receive is in the process of humbling. Is just, you know, it's this crazy linkage, but I think that's, it's fascinating to unpack. I want to finish with this brief story. I've spent a lot of time in India, and for the last 8 years, and I had a moment where we work with leaders there who are from what's called Dalit and tribal populations of people. They are outside of the caste system. They literally, many of them don't exist within the caste. So in many ways, that's why they're called untouchables, or outside of that. And so I was with a group of leaders from this space in India. And I asked them, I said, how do you see me? And one of them said, because I was trying to understand how they look at me. Like when I was working with these leaders and I'm working with students on this campus, and one of them said, well, you would be a Brahmin. And I had to, letting that settle was difficult for me. Because I was like, I know what a Brahmin is in their culture, and I thought that is weird, but it also gave me some insight, and I could tell you stories of why they might see me that way, because of, I'm seen as a professor, to have some of that going on, then I'm like, it's just very interesting. So I then went to a session. So we had like 300 leaders in this room, and we work with a leader in India who's serving these populations of people, who has probably 200,000 of these folks in his care. And I walk out of the session, and this is what he said to me. He said, and I would always take doctoral and master's students with me. They'd go to India. And he said, why don't your students carry your bag? And I said, and now all of you are laughing, like, this is a real question. Why don't your students carry your bag? And I was like, no, that would not work. That's not the way we do it. And he said, it doesn't make any sense. He said, here, the students would consider it an honor to carry your bag. And I said, I understand, but it's not the way it works. I wouldn't want them to do that. It's like, we don't do that. And he said, well, then I'll carry your bag. And this is a leader who has sacrificed so much to serve these people. And I said, no. And I started to fight with him over my bag. So I'm like, we're literally wrestling over my bag. He finally takes it from me. And then we walk across this campus, and I have a picture of it. I wish I could show you, of me awkwardly walking behind him as he's carrying my bag. Strangest moment for me to experience. And the moments that followed after that, of of me kind of it being turned around for me, where we at one point made a gesture to the leaders that we're working with, and we put them all in a circle and we touched their feet. And after I touched the first person's feet, now think of the way these leaders just told me that they perceive me, they started to beg me not to touch their feet. And I was in the middle of this unbelievable character controversy between my capacity to give and receive and the controversy that opened up. And I would tell you that my time in India has had deep impacts and imprints on my character. So as you get into this conversation, I think what I'm inspired to think about, I'm going to give you my 3 points again, then let's go. And then Daniel will launch us out, is that generosity is about our character. And that generosity is about us and also about them. And how do you feel about that? Like, where is this reality? Could you live in that tension? And that our generosity may be related to our capacity to receive. I don't know where you want to go. You get to go wherever you want to go. That's smarter. So let's go, Dr. Halleck.
I love it. You lit my...
I thought you were kidding.
Hey, Matt, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I've enjoyed, Matt is a friend of WiLD who I've enjoyed getting to know a little bit over this last year, and hearing a bit of your story. I love having people just jump in. I think this is the first time you've been with us in the WiLD conversation. So I didn't tell you what I was going to ask you, but what I'd love to hear, I love doing the spotlights because it gives me a chance. When I read through the chat, I can't help but reflect on someone else's reflection. And I can't help but think about my own story as I hear someone else's. So with that, Matt, I'd love to hear, first tell people who you are so they have some context what you do. And I'd love to hear what from today's conversation, either something Dr. McKenna shared or something that you had a conversation in your breakout group. What is inspiring you personally in this conversation today?
So intro first and then share my thought. So hi, my name is Matt Ramerman. I live here in Snohomish, Washington with my wife and 2 beautiful daughters. And professionally, I lead a division of a large telecommunications company called Cinch that's based in Stockholm, Sweden. So I lead a team here in the Americas on behalf of Cinch. But the conversation today was great. And I think there are 2 concepts in my breakout group that I'm going to take away and wrestle with a bunch. Coming into this topic, I felt a lot of anxiety coming into this because I felt like this is going to really force me to look at what is my generous self, which I'll wrestle with. But the 2 concepts my group talked about that I thought were really compelling. One concept was around would I be generous if it was anonymous, or essentially I wasn't getting credit for that generosity, which I think is a really powerful question. And then the other that Ron posted at the end, I think it's in the chat, it's just this concept of can generosity be really the ultimate selfish act if we're truly getting more than we're giving? So I thought those were all really interesting concepts that I'll spend a good chunk of my weekend thinking about. So yeah, thank you for that.
That's awesome. That is okay. Say those 2 questions again. That first one grabbed me. What the 2 questions you'll wrestle through?
Yeah, one is just the idea of would I be generous if I knew I wasn't getting credit?
That's fascinating.
Wasn't getting public recognition for that, and then the second is this concept of can generosity be truly the ultimate selfish act?
That is fascinating. Some great deeper things. I'm excited to hear how you process it. And
Yeah,
you'll have to check in with us and let you know. I will be processing that as well, and also thinking about that paradox of receiving and giving, as we often find ourselves on both sides of the equation. So thanks, Matt, for jumping in. And like I said, I loved in the spotlight. I can't help but hear you reflect and think a little bit deeper about what does that look like and how does that challenge me, and even those connections of generosity to character and leading. So this has been an incredibly meaningful conversation as we continue in our